Hey everybody, so we are going to go ahead and go through a quick review of everything we went through over the last 5 days. So this is our PFT 105 midterm review. So obviously, we spent a lot of time talking about metabolism in general, right? And we got to get away from like the colloquial definition of metabolism when we kind of need to remember like our scientific definition, which is any and all chemical reactions that are taking place within the body. So this is going to go in two directions, right? It's either going to be anabolic, where your body is bonding smaller molecules to make up a larger molecule. So that would be like a building up reaction, or it's going to be a catabolic reaction, where your body is actually breaking stuff down. It's taking something complex and breaking it into its individual pieces. So your body has different processes by which it does this in order to have its anabolism or its catabolism. And anabolism is going to use a process called dehydration synthesis, where basically your body actually pulls the components of a water molecule out of two other pieces, and that causes those pieces to be attracted together and link. So it's the process of building up two simple molecules into something much more complex by dehydrating both of them a little bit. Catabolic reactions, the way we break stuff down, we're going to use a process called hydrolysis, and that's where you're actually using water molecules to break up a complex molecule into individual pieces. And so water molecule kind of donates half of itself to one side and half of itself to the other, and that splits that molecule apart. Now, obviously, both of those are chemical reactions, and they need something to kind of kick that whole thing off. I mean, it can happen naturally on its own, but when you add little proteins called enzymes, they can actually coordinate and make those changes happen a little bit more quickly and a little bit more easily. So enzymes are going to be present throughout our entire body, and they really assist with our metabolism by kicking those chemical reactions off. So one of the most important types of chemical reactions that we're going to be talking about is how our body actually produces ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. And so your body is going to produce adenosine triphosphate, which is basically like the currency for your body. Like, it's how your body pays for all of the work that it does through a process of cellular respiration. So that describes how our bodies take in nutrients in order to spit out energy or spit out ATP, right? So the three main types that we're going to have is glycolysis, the citric acid or Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So those are the systems that our body uses to produce ATP molecules. Glycolysis is what we call an anabolic, an anaerobic reaction, actually, not anabolic. And so it's an anaerobic reaction means that it takes place without oxygen, right? It takes place in the absence of oxygen, and it uses glucose molecules to produce ATP, right? So what will happen is a molecule of glucose will go through glycolysis to produce a molecule called pyruvic acid. And because it's in a no oxygen environment, that pyruvic acid will convert into lactic acid. And then that can be used in the next system, which is your citric acid cycle. And that's an aerobic process. This is where your body starts actually bringing in oxygen molecules to produce ATP. And so it's an aerobic reaction, so with oxygen, used to produce ATP. And this takes place in our mitochondria. It uses the byproducts of glycolysis and some B vitamins, which we're going to refer to as like coenzymes. Like B vitamins are going to act as those enzymes to kick off the Krebs cycle effectively to produce ATP. And then you're left with some more byproducts, which are called NAD and FAD. And that NAD and FAD is going to go through a process called the electron transport chain, which is another aerobic process that also relies on the byproducts of the system before it in order to spit out a whole bunch of ATP. So that's sort of like describing why it's so important for us to breathe oxygen and why it's so important for our cells to breathe oxygen as well. Now, the other nutrient we talked about was glucose, right? We have to have a system that breaks down glucose, and we also need to have like proteins and fats and stuff like that to make new cells. And so luckily, we have this really great de-assembly line called our digestive system. And that's a system responsible for mechanically through things like chewing and chemically through things like our stomach acid, breaking food particles down in order to be into their individual components. They get down into a chemical level. And once they're at a chemical level, they can be absorbed directly by our digestive system. So the process of digestion is all about breaking stuff down, and the process of absorption is all about getting stuff to pass into our actual bloodstream so they can get carried throughout our body into all of our individual cells. So the first part of digestion is going to take place in our mouth through things like chewing, and that's a really good example of like a mechanical breakdown. But we also have something called salivary amylase, which is an enzyme that our salivary glands, our spit glands, create that are really good at breaking down that is able to break down carbohydrates into what we call disaccharides. And disaccharides are basically double sugar molecules. So you were to take like a really big complex sugar, big complex starch, and you were to put it into your saliva, it would start to break it down. It wouldn't break it all the way down into just its individual components. Like it can't break it down into glucose, which is a monosaccharide, a one sugar molecule, but it can get it down to two. And that'll make the rest of our process of digestion much easier. Then it's going to drop, food's going to drop into your stomach, which is this kind of J-shaped pouch, and it's got a whole bunch of different layers in it that are used to produce like different materials, right? One of the most important of which is going to be what is called hydrochloric acid. And that's an extremely acidic material that helps break down foods. There's also going to be a lot of protein breakers in there, which is called pepsin. And pepsin aids in the process of digestion by breaking down proteins into individual amino acids. So amino acids, which we're going to see a little bit later in this presentation, are basically the building blocks of proteins. And so when you assemble a whole bunch of amino acids into a big, really cool shape, you have like a protein. And so pepsin is the material that actually breaks the bonds between those amino acids to where it's not a protein anymore, it's just its individual components. Once it's its individual components, our body can take it and take those amino acids and build them up into some other shape. So you can take a chicken breast and turn it into a pectoral muscle. So then once everything is kind of broken down and really soupy, there's a little, like the one last thing that's kind of surviving here are our fats. Fats tend to do fairly well through the stomach acid, and that's why once they drop into the small intestine, which is primarily like where we absorb nutrients, and that's what we definitely want to think of when we think of our small intestine, but there is a little bit more digestion that happens here as well. So your liver, which is an accessory organ, is going to produce this material called bile, and bile is this thing that acts as like what we call an emulsifier. And basically its job is to break up fat molecules. Fat molecules are stacked really well closely together, and it makes it really hard for them to be broken apart. And so with something like bile, that's really good at shoving itself in there and emulsifying and breaking up those fats. Now, the liver produces your bile, but it doesn't actually eject it into your digestive system. Your gallbladder is actually responsible for that. So your liver is always producing bile, and it stores any excess that it makes into your gallbladder. So the gallbladder doesn't necessarily make bile, but this is where your gallbladder is in charge of dropping that bile off into your small intestine. So it's this little pear-shaped organ that secretes it into the actual small intestine there. You've also got your pancreas, which is also sharing a common tube with those other ones, and that's an accessory organ that is creating enzymes that also break down fats and carbohydrates if they happen to, survive your stomach acid. So now all that took place in the first part of the small intestine, but now we start to get into like the main body of the small intestine, where really the small intestine goes to work doing its main job, which is absorption, the process of allowing chemicals to pass from the digestive system into our actual bloodstream. And so in your small intestine, you're going to have all of these little tiny hairs called your intestinal villi, or you can just call them your villi, right? And they're these little projections that line your blood vessels, that line your small intestine that are covered in blood vessels. So when you look at your small intestine, you're going to see it's kind of folded like this. There's a lot of like little tiny folds inside, and those folds are what we call lumen. And the folds are covered in hairs, which we call villi. And then those villi are actually covered in other hairs called microvilli. Microvilli's job is to like move nutrients around to get into the holes. And that's how we actually absorb stuff into our bloodstream. And it's so microscopic. This is happening on a chemical level. Now, there's a little bit more absorption that also takes place in your large intestine. So food will continue moving through your small intestine until it finally gets to your large intestine, which is primarily responsible for like absorbing all of the water that we drink and other liquids, right? This is where it's absorbing a lot of that. But it's also responsible for like the process of elimination. So there's a lot of like gut bacteria in your large intestine, which can break down anything that happened to survive, making it easier for you to pass that food out of your body. So that's a really good understanding of like all the anatomy that allows us to kind of take in nutrients. But we have to also have a pretty good understanding of our nutrients. And so we have the study of that, which is called nutrition, right? And nutrition is going to be the study of our 6 essential nutrients. Those are going to be your macronutrients, which are proteins, fats, and carbs, your micronutrients, which are vitamins and minerals, and water. So those are the 6, right? So macronutrients, the reason they're called macro is because you need them in super large quantities. First one we're going to talk about is carbohydrates. These are big complex chains of sugars, right? You're going to see monosaccharides, which are single sugar molecules. Glucose is a really good example of that, right? Our digestive system's job is to take complex carbohydrates and break them into those sugars so that they can be used for ATP production. You've also got disaccharides, which are double sugar molecules. They're slightly more complex. You know, they're twice as large because they're 2 sugar molecules bound together, but they're still relatively simple. We would still consider this a simple carbohydrate. And then we have polysaccharides, such as starches and glycogen. These are really complex carbohydrates that take a lot longer to break down because of their big, long chains. And so that's why we have our digestive system to kind of help us break this down. We're also going to see fiber in here, which is extremely complex carbohydrates that are stacked together so efficiently that the digestive system cannot break it down. And so your fiber is actually something like cellulose, and that's such a complex carbohydrate, and it's stacked together so well that we can't even digest it. And that's a good thing, because anytime we eat something that doesn't get broken down very effectively, fiber is going to kind of work its way through the digestive system and grab onto any of that and help us make an exit out the body. So then we also have proteins. That's another macronutrient, right? That is a big complex chain of what we talked about earlier, those amino acids. So amino acids, right, they all come together to form up this big complex protein. They're the building blocks there. Now, you've got 2 categories of amino acids. You're going to see what are called essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. Now, any protein is made up of amino acids, right? You can't have a protein unless you have all of those ingredients present. But when we're talking about like essential amino acids, those are essential that we eat them. They're amino acids that our body cannot produce. Whereas like non-essential amino acids, you can actually make from other amino acids. Like if you just break them up and kind of change the order a little bit, it's like, boom, I've got that non-essential amino acid. So certain foods, like for instance foods from plant sources, are what we call incomplete proteins. And it's because they are missing one or more of those essential amino acids. So if we were to only survive on like a diet, like if the only protein we were getting, and this would practically be impossible, but if you were to only get your protein from something like beans alone, unfortunately beans are missing a few of those essential amino acids. So our body cannot do protein synthesis. But you can make it a complete protein by pairing it up with another plant source that might be missing, that might have those missing amino acids. And so like if you were to consume beans and rice together, that's going to create a complete protein because that will have all of the amino acids present. And that's what we call complementary foods. Now, obviously, we also have animal sources. Animal sources, because an animal's body and their cells assembled those proteins, it has all of the essential amino acids. So plant sources tend to be what we've referred to as like incomplete proteins, and animal sources tend to be what we refer to as complete proteins. And it's because plant sources are missing one or more, and animal sources have all of them. And then our last macronutrient here, something that we need lots of every day, is going to be fat. Fat is really important because it's like these big complex chains of amino acids. It's how our body makes cholesterol, which helps us synthesize hormones. It's how our body produces cell walls, which is obviously very important. It gives our body structure. It helps insulate the body. And it also can be metabolized to produce ATP in the aerobic parts of our metabolism. So our micronutrients are nutrients that we need in smaller quantities, right? These are nutrients that we need very little of every day. Rather than measuring these things in grams, we're usually measuring them in milligrams or even micrograms. And so these are very, very small quantities, and they are made up of what we call minerals and vitamins, right? Minerals are inorganic substances. A lot of times they make up like the structures of our body and they aid in like metabolism. So you're going to have major minerals and trace minerals, right? So for instance, later on, we're going to talk about like action potentials, how our body generates electrochemical signals. Well, it uses the minerals, sodium and potassium, to do that because those two ions have different levels of charge. And so major minerals are minerals that you need in greater than 100 milligrams per day, and trace minerals are ones that you need in less than 100 milligrams per day. Now we also have vitamins. Vitamins are compounds that assist in metabolic processes. They're going to be split into two categories as well. You're going to see fat-soluble vitamins, which are vitamins that are carried by molecules of fat or they're broken down in fat, and water-soluble vitamins, which are carried by water or broken down in water. And so your fat-soluble vitamins are going to be your vitamins A, D, E, and K. Their job is to like assist in metabolic processes. Like they are helping minerals get uptaken. So for instance, vitamin D helps you utilize calcium more effectively. And then your water-soluble vitamins are all of your vitamins B1 through 12, right? That's your B complex. And vitamin C is also water-soluble as well. And so that's job is to like assist in metabolism. So when we talked about the Krebs cycle earlier, right? The Krebs cycle relies on B vitamins to act as coenzymes in order for us to metabolically produce ATP. But then you're also going to see things like vitamin C, which is going to act as like an antioxidant and also assist in immune function. And then arguably our most important nutrient is going to be water, right? This is the one that we need in the most amounts, the largest amounts per day. It's responsible for not only like cooling the body, but also it assists in hydrolysis. So it allows us to have metabolism and provides us a means by which to move nutrients throughout our body. Now, when we're talking about nutrition, the big thing that everybody always wants to talk about is calories, right? They want to understand like how much energy is trapped within our foods, because that's sort of what determines whether you are making your body larger or making your body smaller or giving your body enough fuel, right? So a calorie is a unit of measurement. It's like an inch or a mile or a second or a pound, right? It's just a unit of measurement that we use to measure how much energy is trapped within foods. So we're going to refer to this as a calorie with a lowercase c, because that's the original version, and it is the amount of energy that is required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So let's say we take it like an uppercase C. That's going to be an uppercase calorie. And let's say we have a kilogram of water. So we have 1,000 grams of water. And we notice that that water goes up by 1 degree Celsius. Well, that means that there is 1 uppercase calorie in whatever that food is. So if it goes up by 50 calories, there's 50 calories in that food. And that's how we sort of calculate how much energy we're seeing. We actually, when we're looking at nutrition labels and it says 250 calories, that's actually an uppercase calorie, even though the nutrition label puts it lowercase. We could go into that. It's very obnoxious. But and the calories listed on like our food labels say like 250. It's technically 250,000 of the original version of what a calorie was intended to be. But nobody wants to deal with numbers that large. So we just uppercased it and call it a calorie. Or sometimes when you go to other countries, you'll see it listed as a kilocalorie, which is, 1,000 lowercase calories. So now let's go ahead and talk about like the other place we're getting energy, which is obviously oxygen, right? And so we're going to have our respiratory system, which is responsible for a process called pulmonary ventilation. That's the process of actually breathing. So we have all this like really cool specialized tools that allow us to do this breathing process, right? So we have our lungs, which are these big sac-like structures that house all of these individual little tubes throughout them. And those tubes are going to be called your bronchi. And so you're going to see your bronchi head down and then split into 2 individual sections. Those bronchi are going to split into even smaller sections, which we call bronchioles. And then those bronchioles are going to end in these little popcorn-shaped sacs called alveoli. And alveoli are covered in capillaries, which are really microscopic blood vessels. Just like we talked about, your digestive system is lined with capillaries to allow nutrients to pass into your blood. Well, your alveoli are also covered in pulmonary capillaries. covered in capillaries to allow the exchange of nutrients there. So they're called pulmonary capillaries because pulmonary is talking about your lungs as a system. So when we're talking about respiration, we're not just talking about like breathing in air and breathing air out, right? That's ventilation. But respiration is absorbing those oxygen molecules, right? Letting it pass from one side of a wall to another. So external respiration is where oxygen is moving into our blood and carbon dioxide is moving out of our blood in order for us to exhale. But internal respiration is also occurring on a cellular level. You know, if that oxygen molecule is being carried by a red blood cell and it gets to a tissue and drops off that oxygen, that tissue basically just breathed in that O2 molecule, right? So that's internal respiration. That's happening on a cellular level. Now, when we're talking about breathing, normal quiet breathing, like your normal pace, we would just refer to that as what was called your tidal volume, right? It kind of sounds like the tide, air going in and air going out. And we obviously have more volumes beyond that, but that's definitely the one that we are more commonly deal with. When you are exercising, you are going to tap into your inspiratory and expiratory reserve, which is all the space that you have to breathe beyond your tidal volume. You know, like I'm doing this big review right now and I'm speaking in these big long sentences. There's a lot of times where I get out of breath and then I have to take a big deep breath in, and that's beyond my tidal volume. But normal tidal volume is just your quiet breathing when you're having a conversation, reading a book, whatever. So like we already talked about, there's a lot of gas exchange that's occurring. And so that's all happening between your alveoli and your actual like environment there, which are your blood vessels, right? And that is your pulmonary capillaries. And then your body's tissues, that's taking place between, you know, your body's cells and the oxygen molecules in your red blood cells. Now, how do we actually carry those O2 molecules around? Well, luckily we have two proteins that are responsible for actually binding to oxygen and carrying it wherever it needs to go. And so one of those proteins is going to be what is called hemoglobin. Heme for the word blood, and globin for the word for a globular protein of oxygen. And so it's a protein that carries a molecule of iron and is used to actually carry that oxygen around. Now you also have myoglobin, which is located in your muscle cells. And myoglobin is a protein that binds oxygen and delivers it to the mitochondria. So if we imagine like a red blood cell picking up an oxygen molecule at the lungs and then it travels to whatever tissue it's going to, it's attached to the red blood cell thanks to hemoglobin. But then hemoglobin is going to pass it off to myoglobin to allow myoglobin to deliver it to the mitochondria of that tissue. And that's basically what's happening in our respiratory system. Now, obviously, we have to be able to pump all this stuff around. We've been talking about blood a little bit. And so we have a system that works really intimately with our respiratory system called our cardiovascular system. This is going to be your heart, your blood, and your blood vessels. And it's really in charge of like delivering everything, right? So your heart is a muscular pump that maintains pressure by having these four big chambers: your left atrium, your right atrium, left ventricle, and right ventricle. So if we start on like the right side of our heart, your right atrium gathers deoxygenated blood. So let's say that blood cell's done its job, it delivered oxygen to whatever tissue it was supposed to deliver it to, and now it's got to get back to the lungs, right? Well, it's going to drop into the right atrium to be gathered. That's what atrium means. It's a gathering site, right? So the right atrium will gather that blood, which will then drop into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will then contract in order to pump blood into our lungs. And once it gets into our lungs, now it can drop off the carbon dioxide that it's been carrying and pick up new oxygen. But it can't get to the tissues unless it gets delivered there. So it's got to go back to the heart to be, you know, sent wherever it's going. And so it'll come back from the lungs into the left atrium. Again, it's going to gather there. And then it will drop into the left ventricle where it will be pumped out throughout our entire body. So the left ventricle is arguably the most important for us because that's really what we are using to determine like how much pressure our heart can generate, right? How hard it squeezes to pump blood throughout our body. But obviously all the chambers are important. If you don't have those chambers working effectively, your heart cannot generate and maintain pressure. Now, one thing I do want to mention your heart is contracting at a very specific signal, which we refer to as your heart rate. So as you increase activity, your heart's rate increases as well in response to that. Like as I need to produce more ATP, I need to deliver more oxygen. So my heart's going to start beating in response to that increased need for oxygen. And so that pace of the heart is actually controlled by this little node, this little electric node that works with your nervous system, and it's housed in your right atrium called your sinoatrial node or your SA node, and it's the pacemaker of the heart. So when your nervous system says, hey, like our blood's getting a little acidic because we're doing so much work, we should probably bring in some more oxygen. We need to deliver that oxygen throughout the body. Let's increase blood pressure. Let's increase heart rate. Your nervous system kind of figures that out and makes it happen. It zaps that, it sends a signal to the sinoatrial node, which then sends the signal to the rest of the heart cells that trigger them to actually contract. And so talking about the layers of the heart and talking about heart cells being able to contract, your heart is made up of a lot of different layers. You have your epicardium, which is the layer on the outside of the heart, and that's just providing like a barrier between like materials outside and materials inside. You get the endocardium, which is serving basically the same purpose. That's providing a separation between the inside and the outside. But then in the middle, you've got your myocardium, which is this really, really thick muscular wall. And that's where all the actual contractions take place, right? Myocardium is going to have myofilaments, just like our muscles do, that allow like contraction and relaxation to occur. And we'll get into contractions and relaxations in just a little bit. Now, obviously, like if we're going to pump stuff out of the blood, we've got to have a place for that blood to go. And so we have our blood vessels, which is a series of tubes that, flow throughout our body and cover our tissues and allow the exchange for oxygen and nutrients and things like that. And so the three main types of blood vessels that you're going to have are going to be your arteries, which are blood vessels that are carrying blood away from the heart, veins, which are carrying blood towards the heart, and capillaries. And capillaries are really tiny microscopic blood vessels that basically create like a webbing and they cover body's tissues. And that's where really all of this nutrient transportation and nutrient exchange is taking place. So one of the most important types of tissues that's really hungry for things like oxygen and nutrients are going to be our muscles. So understanding like the neurology of our muscles, we got to look at like the structure of a muscle cell first. And so we would call a muscle cell a muscle fiber. Inside muscle cells, they have these special proteins called myofilaments, and they basically are really good at binding to each other, and they want to bind to each other all the time. But there are some other proteins in there that are keeping that from happening. So if we're looking at our myofilaments, we've got our really thin filaments, this big long string like this. That myofilament is called actin, and it's full of all these little binding sites that another protein called myosin really wants to reach up and grab so that it can change its shape and pull towards its center. And that myosin has these little club-like heads. So myosin's really attracted to actin. And so what happens is when you see like the way it's arranged, you've got two thin strands of actin here and a central myosin strand with arms over here and arms over here. And they both reach up, grab, and pull towards the center. And that draws actin towards its midline, and that shortens the muscle cell. And so if that's happening in thousands of muscle cells simultaneously, you're going to experience a muscular contraction. Now, because these things are so attracted to each other, we have to have another protein there as well, which is a regulatory protein. And that regulatory protein is there to keep these things from binding. That way we can relax our muscles. And that regulatory protein, or those regulatory proteins rather, are going to be called troponin and tropomyosin. So troponin is this little protein that likes to bind to calcium, and tropomyosin is a big long strand that actually covers the binding sites. And they're there to kind of keep that from happening whenever we want to relax our muscle. So the process of like this whole thing that we just talked about is called the sliding filament theory, or the sliding filament model. And that's basically describing how actin and myosin bind together to create muscular contractions. Now, all of that is under the control of your nervous system, right? And so you have specialized nerve cells called motor neurons that are in charge of working with your muscular system. They're in charge of creating that contraction by zapping your muscles, basically. right? And so we have a thing called an excitation-contraction coupling, which is where motor neurons are actually interacting with muscle cells, right? So nerve cells are interacting with muscle cells in order to create contraction. So there is an excitation that causes a contraction because they are coupling. So what a muscular contraction is, right, is again, it's when the sliding filament model occurs. And so a muscle contraction will occur anytime there's an excitation contraction coupling that triggers what is called an action potential, right? So anytime motor neuron zaps a muscle, the muscle actually creates its own electric charge and a bunch of really cool things start to happen. Now, how do we get the nervous system to tell the muscular system to create that contraction? Well, we use this little chemical called a neurotransmitter. And these are neurotransmitters in general are chemicals that trigger all kinds of different chemical effects. Like when your brain wants to be happy, it'll create a neurotransmitter called dopamine, right? When your body wants to be in love, it'll create a neurotransmitter called oxytocin. And so, we've got a lot of different neurotransmitters throughout our body, but the one that's most relevant to us is going to be what's called acetylcholine, or ACH, and that is actually responsible for triggering that event. So a motor neuron will have its electric charge, and once it reaches the end of its tail there, it will release acetylcholine from the neuron across this little gap into a muscle cell. And when that neurotransmitter binds to the muscle cell, that will trigger an electric signal that runs throughout the muscle. And that muscle will release a whole bunch of calcium ions that it's been storing up. Yeah, your muscles keep a bunch of calcium stored up because calcium is what attracts those proteins we talked about earlier, specifically troponin. Troponin is super attracted to calcium. So when calcium is released into the muscle, troponin is like, oh my gosh, I've got to go bind with that calcium. And so it moves away. That exposes all of the actin's binding sites. And so myosin's able to reach up, grab, and pull. And that's what creates a contraction. You wouldn't think it would have so many steps. In the end, when we're looking at our muscles, like we've talked about the small, let's go ahead and take a look at the large. We've got to take a look at like our different muscle fiber types, because sometimes we're really good at producing lots of energy on the go. Sometimes we're really good at having lots of proteins to create contractions. And so that results in two different strengths of contractions and two different levels of stamina. So you're going to have different fiber types that we're going to classify based on what we see within those muscle fibers, right? So type 1 fibers are when we see a muscle fiber that has a lot more mitochondria, it has a lot more capillaries, and it has a lot more myoglobin and hemoglobin and things like that. So it has a lot of those materials that are really good at delivering oxygen. And so our type of metabolism that uses oxygen is our aerobic metabolism, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So when you have more of those tools to produce aerobic metabolism, we're going to call it a type 1 muscle fiber, right? It's really good at endurance. It's really good at producing ATP on the go, and it has a lot more myoglobin, hemoglobin, and proteins like that. Then you're going to see type 2 fibers, which are going to be much larger in size, so they're going to have more fluid within the cells, and they're also going to be much better at creating stronger contractions. But we don't see as much mitochondria, we don't see as much blood flow, so we're going to see less blood vessels, and therefore they are not going to be able to produce contractions for as long a time period. They end up building up a bunch of lactic acid, which makes us tired, and then we can't keep going any further. So they're stronger contractions, but they're not used for endurance. And that's like what you think of when you think of the difference between like a sprinter and a marathon runner. So type 2 fibers are going to be divided into two subcategories. You're going to see type 2A fibers, and you're going to see type 2X fibers. And type 2X fibers are like the true fast twitch. They're really, really powerful, but they get exhausted super quickly. Whereas type 2A fibers are kind of like, they got some of the type 1 traits, and that they have a little bit more mitochondria, they have a little bit more aerobic capacity, but they are still very much an anaerobic fiber. And that is pretty much it, guys. You are reviewed. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me, call or text, and I try to get back to you as fast as I can. But take a look on Canvas. You're going to see our 30-question midterm there. Knock it out, kick some butt, and I'll see all you all on Monday. I hope you guys have a great 4th of July.